The laughter echoed through the chamber, a deep, guttural sound that rolled through the assembled crowd of alien dignitaries. They stood tall, their armored forms gleaming under the cold, sterile light of the council hall. Their amusement wasn't just mocking, it was dismissive, laced with the certainty of their own superiority. At the center of it all, a lone human stood. He didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. He just watched. The silence stretched long after the laughter had died down. "You truly believe," one of the towering figures rumbled, "that your kind, your fragile, short-lived species, has anything of value to offer us?" The words were weighted with centuries of conquest. What could you possibly say that we would care to hear? The human exhaled slowly, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I was hoping you'd ask." A murmur rippled through the chamber. This was no mere diplomat. He wasn't here to beg or negotiate from a position of weakness. No, there was something else, something they couldn't quite grasp. The tallest of the alien leaders, a being clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered with intricate patterns of his lineage, narrowed his eyes. "You amuse us, human, but amusement is not respect. Speak then. Say your words, and let them be the last you ever utter." The human stepped forward, his voice calm, measured. And then he spoke, not in galactic standard, not in the trade dialects used between species, not even in the tongue of his own kind. He spoke in their language, but not the language they used now. No, he spoke in something older, something they had forgotten. The moment the first syllable left his lips, the chamber went silent. Not just quiet silent, as if the air itself had thickened, as if the very walls held their breath. The alien leaders, the same ones who had laughed and jeered, now stood frozen. One of them twitched. Another took a step back. The tall one, the leader, went rigid, his eyes wide with something no human had ever seen in his kind before. Fear. A whisper among them. That's not possible. The human continued speaking, his voice unwavering, delivering words that hadn't been spoken aloud for eons. Words that had once carried the weight of power, of rulers and gods, of forgotten empires buried beneath the dust of time. One of the aliens collapsed to his knees, trembling. Another turned sharply, hands clenching at the hilt of a ceremonial blade, as if instinct screamed at him to strike to silence this impossible sound before it was too late. The leader's breath came shallow, his gaze locked onto the human as if looking at something unnatural, something that should not exist. Who taught you this?" he finally rasped. The human smiled, just a little. "That's the wrong question," he said. He took another step forward, and they didn't stop him. They didn't move at all. "The real question is, why did your ancestors try to erase it?" The tension snapped like a live wire. One of the lesser council members recoiled, his voice a panicked hiss. "You do not understand what you are saying." "Oh," the human countered, tilting his head slightly. "I understand perfectly." He spoke again, this time weaving the words together in a slow, deliberate cadence. And as he did, the very structure of the chamber seemed to hum a deep resonance vibrating through the stone, the metal, the bones of those who had thought themselves above him. The leader took a stumbling step back. "You need to stop." "Why?" the human asked, taking another step forward. "Because—" The alien's voice wavered, the certainty he had once held slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Because it was forbidden." The human's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "Not forbidden," he corrected. "Buried." Another step. More silence. The alien leader's hands curled into fists, his body tensed in a way that spoke of an instinctive reaction buried beneath layers of conditioning. He wanted to strike. He wanted to stop this. But he couldn't. Because something older than his authority, something primal, told him that if he did, it would be worse. The human spoke again. And this time, it wasn't just words. It was a command. A name. A truth pulled from the bones of their history. The leader flinched as if struck. His eyes burned with denial, but his body betrayed him. He staggered, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "What have you done?" the leader whispered. The human exhaled. I just reminded you who you really are. And then, somewhere beyond the chamber walls, something answered. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over the alien leaders like a shroud. The human remained still, his expression unreadable, waiting. He had said only a few words, but the reaction they provoked was more powerful than any weapon. Then the sound came again. Faint at first, like a whisper moving through the very foundation of the structure. It wasn't just noise, it was presence. It slithered into the air, into their bones, into something deeper than memory. It was recognition. The leader of the council gritted his teeth, his breath sharp and uneven. His claws flexed involuntarily before he forced his hands to his sides. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "This language is dead." It was erased. The human's gaze didn't waver. Clearly, not well enough. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled aliens. Some were still struggling to breathe normally, their minds reeling from something they didn't fully understand, but felt in every fiber of their being. Others exchanged glances, wordless communication passing between them, fear, suspicion, something dangerously close to desperation. One of them finally found his voice. "Tell us," he said, his tone a careful mix of command and plea. "Where did you learn this?" The human let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. "You should be asking why it was buried in the first place." The leader's eyes darkened, the ridges along his jaw tightening. "You think we don't know our own history, human?" "I think," the human replied evenly, "that you know the version of history you were allowed to know." He took a step forward. No one stopped him. "But your ancestors knew something you don't. Something so dangerous that they tried to destroy all traces of it. And yet, here we are." The whispering sound in the background had grown louder. Not a voice, not exactly. More like an echo of something just beyond reach. The aliens could feel it pressing at the edges of their minds. Something old. Something hungry. One of the younger council members turned to his leader, his eyes wide. "This should not be happening." "I know." The leader's voice was strained, his claws curling into the fabric of his ceremonial robes. He turned his full attention back to the human. "Who sent you?" The human smiled faintly. "No one. We found it ourselves." The leader's nostrils flared. "Impossible." "Is it?" The human's tone remained calm, but there was something beneath it, something deliberate. "It was written in places you thought were dust. Inscribed in ruins so old even your kind barely remembers them. But humans, we remember things others try to forget. We dig. We uncover. And we don't stop." A deep, uneasy silence followed. The aliens had spent generations believing they were the pinnacle of civilization, the masters of knowledge and history. And yet, standing before them was a human who had touched something beyond their reach. One of the aliens, his skin a shade darker than the others, his armor marked with insignias of war, took a slow step forward. His voice was quieter, but no less firm. "Do you even understand what you've awoken?" The human's expression shifted. Not to fear, not to uncertainty, but something almost amused. "Do you?" The leader snarled, his patience snapping. "Enough of these games. If you truly know what you speak of, then say it plainly. What have you found?" The human studied him for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, he spoke a name. It was not a name that should exist, not a name that should be heard. The reaction was immediate. The leader stumbled back as if struck. Another alien let out a strangled gasp, clutching his chest as though his heart had just clenched in his ribcage. One of them, an older counselor, his eyes clouded with age, made a sound between a wheeze and a whimper before dropping to his knees. "No," the leader whispered, shaking his head in denial. "That name is lost. It was wiped from time." "Was it?" The human tilted his head slightly. "Or was it just hidden?" A heavy stillness followed. The air itself felt wrong, as if the weight of the name alone had altered something fundamental. The leader's hands clenched into fists. "If you know that name, then you have no idea what you've unleashed. The human's expression didn't change. Then tell me. The leader hesitated. For the first time, true uncertainty flickered across his face. He wanted to deny it, to reject the very possibility. But something in the way the human stood calm, assured, told him there was no use in pretending. One of the counselors, still kneeling, finally found his voice. It was weak, barely a whisper. If he speaks it again, they will hear. The human gave a slow nod. Good. The leader sucked in a sharp breath. You have no idea what you're doing. I think I do. The sound from beyond the chamber walls grew louder. Not a voice, but something more. Something stirring. Something waiting. The leader took a step back, his composure finally cracking. He turned to his subordinates. Seal the doors. Now. Panic flickered through the ranks. One of the guards hesitated. But do it. The great doors of the chamber groaned as they began to close, thick slabs of reinforced metal and stone grinding together. The human didn't react. He didn't flinch. He only stood there, watching. You think shutting the doors will keep it out? He asked, his voice almost curious. The leader shot him a sharp look. No. His expression darkened, his eyes burning with something close to fury. I think it will keep you in. The last sliver of light between the closing doors narrowed, then vanished. The chamber was deathly silent. The thick metal doors had sealed with a final, echoing thud, cutting off the outside world. No one spoke. No one dared to. The alien leaders stood rigid, their breathing shallow, their eyes darting between one another. The weight of the moment pressed against them like an unseen force. The human, still standing in the center of the room, tilted his head slightly. That was a mistake. The leader of the council clenched his fists. No, human. The mistake was yours. His voice was tight, controlled, but beneath it there was something else. Fear. The whispering sound had not stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger, as if something beyond the chamber walls was waking up, stretching, becoming aware. The aliens could feel it crawling against their senses, like fingers reaching into the back of their minds. The presence was not fully here yet, but it was close. One of the younger counselors turned sharply to his leader. We have to contain this. There is no containing it, the human interrupted. His voice was calm, almost resigned. You've known that all along, haven't you? The leader's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing. You still don't understand what you've done. The human finally moved, slowly pacing to the edge of the chamber, running his fingers along the smooth stone walls. I think I understand more than you want me to. He stopped, turning back toward them. You erased your own past. You wiped out your own history. But history has a way of bleeding through the cracks, no matter how deep you bury it. One of the council members, an older alien with deep-set eyes, let out a shaky breath. You shouldn't have spoken that name. The human studied him for a long moment. Why not? What are you so afraid of? The older alien swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the others before he spoke. Because names are not just words. Not this one. It carries weight, power. And now it knows we are here. The human's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. He had expected resistance, denial, but this was something else. They were afraid, truly afraid. The leader took a step forward, his movements sharp and controlled. You've made yourself a target, human. You think you have knowledge, but you're reckless. You don't understand what you've set in motion. The human gave a small, humorless smile. That's where you're wrong. His voice lowered slightly, but the confidence in it didn't waver. I knew exactly what I was doing the moment I walked into this room. The leader's expression darkened. You want to test fate? Fine, but you won't leave this chamber alive. The air shifted. The guards along the walls moved, their hands gripping weapons that hummed with energy. The tension was thick, an unspoken command hanging in the air. But then, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting. And then, something knocked. Not at the door, not at the walls, but somewhere deeper, below. Inside, the aliens froze. The human remained still. The knock came again, louder. This time, the very floor beneath them seemed to shudder, the vibration crawling up their legs like a living thing. One of the guards took an unconscious step back, his grip tightening on his weapon. A third knock. This time, the lights flickered. A voice not spoken, not heard, but felt whispered something just at the edge of perception. It wasn't in the alien language. It wasn't in the humans. It was in the dead language. The leader's face lost all color. His breathing quickened. No, it cannot. But the human heard it. And he understood. His gaze lifted slowly, his lips parting as he whispered the words back, his voice calm, steady, unafraid. The walls trembled. The air thickened. The sealed doors groaned as if something pressed against them from the other side. The leader spun toward the guards. Reinforce the seals? Now. But it was too late. With a deafening crack, something answered the call. The doors shuddered, groaning under the unseen force pressing against them. The lights flickered violently now, casting erratic shadows across the chamber walls. The alien counselors stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of dread and disbelief. The guards hesitated, their weapons trembling in their hands. Then, a sound, deep and resonant, filled the air. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't metal bending under stress. It was a voice. Low, ancient, layered with something far beyond mere language. The walls seemed to drink in the sound, vibrating like a struck bell. The human recognized it immediately. It was the same tongue he had spoken moments ago, the one they had sworn was lost forever. One of the council members staggered back, clutching his head. It's speaking. It's speaking again. The leader turned on the human, his face pale with fury and fear. Stop this. Stop it now. The human didn't move. His breathing was steady, his gaze locked on the trembling doors. He had spent years piecing together fragments of their lost language, years uncovering what they had tried so desperately to erase. And now, that knowledge had called something back from the void. The deep voice spoke again, louder this time, shaking dust from the ceiling. The air grew thick, pressing against their lungs, making each breath a struggle. The guards braced themselves, weapons raised, but it was useless. Whatever was behind those doors wasn't something they could fight. One of the younger aliens dropped his weapon. His hands trembled as he turned to his leader. You told us it was gone. You told us we buried it forever. The leader's jaw clenched, his body tense with rage. We did. This shouldn't be happening. The knocking returned no, not knocking. Pounding. Heavy, relentless, like fists striking stone from the other side of reality itself. The chamber walls groaned, veins of darkness spreading through them like cracks in shattered glass. Then the doors bent inward. Not from an explosion, not from force alone, but as if the very space around them was warping, being pulled apart. The guards opened fire. Blue energy bolts streaked toward the door, colliding with the twisting metal, but they vanished on impact. Swallowed. Absorbed. The voice from beyond the doors shifted, growing deeper, more distorted. The words stretched and twisted into something that no longer resembled language but raw, undeniable presence. The human felt it, then something vast, ancient, aware. And it was looking right at him. The leader staggered back, his composure cracking. You don't understand what you've done, human. You didn't discover our past. You unleashed it. The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the doors burst open. The explosion of force sent bodies flying. The doors didn't just break, they dissolved, pulled into the void beyond. A howling wind, thick with dust and voices that had no source, ripped through the chamber. The human braced himself against the current, eyes locked on the gaping darkness where the entrance had once stood. Something was coming through. The council leader shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "Seal it! Seal it now!" The guards scrambled to react, but it was too late. Shadows spilled from the threshold like ink in water, shifting, moving not like smoke, not like liquid, but something in between. The figures within were tall, indistinct, wrapped in the same void they emerged from. Then, one of them spoke. A single word, sharp and piercing, like the crack of splitting stone. It was the same language, the dead language, but spoken with a weight that made reality itself tremble. The chamber's walls warped, symbols from forgotten history etching themselves into the metal. The human felt something pull at him, not physically, but deep inside his mind. A memory not his own. A battle, long ago. A world burning. And these voices speaking words of judgment before wiping an entire civilization from existence. The council leader fell to his knees, his arrogance, his certainty gone. His voice was barely a whisper. They weren't just our ancestors. His gaze lifted, filled with raw, naked horror. They were our gods. The human's breath caught. Not ancestors. Not forgotten rulers. These beings had not died out. They had been sealed away. And now, the tallest figure turned its head, staring straight at him. It spoke again. The chamber shook. And the human understood. Not just the words. The meaning. The judgment. They hadn't come for the council. They had come for him. The chamber trembled as the towering figure stepped forward, its form shifting like living smoke wrapped in something too dark to be called a shadow. The human couldn't move, couldn't look away. The words it had spoken still rang in his mind, an ancient weight pressing down on his thoughts. It had called him by a name he didn't recognize yet. Somehow, deep down, he knew it belonged to him. The council leader scrambled backward, his composure shattered. "They weren't supposed to return," he whispered. "The barrier, it was never meant to break." The tallest figure turned its gaze toward the alien leader, and the moment it did, the chamber's air thickened with an unseen force. The alien choked, hands clawing at his throat, his eyes wide with sheer terror. No words were spoken, no physical force applied, yet the council leader collapsed to his knees, gasping like something had ripped the strength from his very being. The human felt his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just an invasion. This wasn't just the return of some lost ancestors. These beings weren't here to reclaim power, they were here to pass judgment. And yet, they weren't looking at the council anymore. They were looking at him. Another voice, deep and layered with echoes, rose from within the figures. "You spoke the words. You broke the silence." The shadows twisted, coiling around the chamber. The guards were frozen, unable to move, their weapons useless in their hands. "You bear the tongue of the forsaken," the voice continued. "And now, you must answer for what was lost." The human clenched his fists. He didn't understand everything, but one thing was clear: these beings weren't here to punish the council. The moment he had spoken their language, the moment he had given voice to the past, he had become something more than just an outsider. He had become the bridge. The figure moved closer. Not walking, gliding. The air around it shimmered like heat distorting reality itself. The human felt something pressing against his mind. A flood of images, memories that were not his own. Cities crumbling. A civilization pleading for mercy. The same council species standing where he stood now, not as rulers, but as the judged. And then, something else. A choice. Long ago, one of them had spoken the dead language before. Not an alien. Not a god. A human. The realization hit like a blow to the chest. This wasn't the first time humanity had encountered these beings. It wasn't the first time one of them had stood at this exact crossroads. The figure reached out, and the human felt the question before it was spoken. "Will you answer as they did?" He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know the full history, the weight of the decision placed before him. But he did know one thing. Whatever choice he made, it would change everything. Forever. The chamber was silent, but the weight of the moment pressed down like an unseen force. The human stood frozen, staring into the endless void of the figure's gaze. The question still echoed in his mind. Will you answer as they did? He didn't know what the ones before him had chosen. He didn't know if they had begged, fought, or surrendered. But something in his gut told him that whatever had happened back then, it had ended in ruin. His hands curled into fists. No, he said. His voice was steady, clear. I'll answer my own way. The chamber pulsed. The figures shifted, their forms rippling as if reality itself had reacted to his defiance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the tallest figure tilted its head, considering him in a way that felt almost amused. You refuse the path of the condemned, it said, yet you wear their burden. A pulse of energy swept through the room. The council leader gasped, his body jolting as if some unseen grip had finally released him. The shadows that had bound the guards flickered, unraveling like mist under sunlight. The walls, once trembling with ancient symbols, grew still. The figures began to step back, retreating into the void from which they had come. But before they disappeared entirely, the tallest one spoke again. Your kind has walked this road before, it said. Once, they failed. This time, we will watch. And then, in a blink, they were gone. The chamber was left in eerie stillness. The human let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The weight that had pressed on his chest was gone, but the unease remained. The figures hadn't punished them. They hadn't destroyed the council. They had left something far worse. A warning! The council leader slowly rose to his feet, shaken beyond words. His arrogance, his power, it had meant nothing in the face of what had just happened. He looked at the human with something new in his eyes. Not hatred, not contempt. Fear. The guards hesitated, as if unsure whether to restrain the human or kneel before him. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was something else. A link to a past long buried. A living reminder of a history the council had tried to erase. The human turned without a word and walked out. The corridors beyond felt different now, as if the station itself had changed in some invisible way. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know what those beings had meant when they said they would watch. But he did know one thing. They weren't laughing at humanity anymore.